The candles in the great corridor of Ashford Park had burned low enough by evening to make shadows of the furniture, and it was in that amber half-dark that Miss Cecily Vane first understood that the Earl of Ashford could not see her. She had come to deliver the household ledger to the study, as she did each Wednesday, walking quietly as a matter of habit, her shoes making almost no sound on the runner. She had expected to find the room empty at this hour. The Earl stood at the window with his back to her, one hand braced against the frame, the other held loosely at his side. He did not turn. She set the ledger on the corner of the desk and stepped back. Still, he did not turn. "Leave it," he said. His voice was level, a little tired. "Thank you, Miss Vane." The way he said her name, without looking, without the small, courteous glance most men produced automatically at the presence of a woman in a room, struck her as strange. He had always seemed a careful man. She withdrew without speaking. It was only in the corridor that she paused, one hand against the wainscoting, and permitted herself to wonder. The dismissal had been too precise, the stillness too deliberate. A man caught in private thought turns when he hears footsteps. A man who cannot see does not bother. She had been housekeeper at Ashford Park for 7 months. She had heard things in those months. Small things. The kind of things servants say when they believe no one of consequence is listening. That the accounts did not balance as they should. That Mr. Hartwell, the steward, had a new horse and a new coat, and had paid a debt in Taunton that had been outstanding for 2 years. She had noticed the ledger numbers herself, and said nothing because she was new, and it was not her place. And she had understood from her first week that the house ran on a set of unspoken agreements she had not yet entirely mapped. Now she stood in the corridor with the amber light guttering at the far end and a new map forming in her mind, and she was not certain what to do with it. The right thing to do with it, she decided at last, was nothing. Not yet. If you have ever worked in a great house, you will understand that decision. Leave a note in the comments if this story is drawing you in already. Lord Edmund Ashford, 5th Earl of Ashford, was 38 years old and had administered this estate since the age of 22, when his father died of a fever contracted at a race meeting in Bath, an end so undignified it had taken the family 2 full seasons to recover from the social cost of it. Edmund had not expected to inherit so young, and had not wanted to. He had wanted to continue with the cavalry, which he had loved, and for which he possessed a genuine aptitude. He had come home instead, and learned the ledgers, and the tenant rolls, and the drainage problems, and the timber contracts, and the roof. He had learned them without complaint, because complaint was a luxury the estate could not afford, and because he was the kind of man who understood that the world does not adjust its requirements to personal preference. He had been married once, for 3 years, to a woman named Caroline, who had died in her second lying in. The child had not survived either. He did not speak of Caroline in the present tense. He had placed her miniature in the drawer of his dressing table rather than on the mantelpiece, a small practical distinction that people who visited the house sometimes remarked upon, and which Edmund declined to explain. The estate itself was old and solid, and demanded his full attention in every season. There were tenant farms across 460 acres, a standing timber contract with a merchant in Taunton, a household of 22 staff, and the annual accounting that his father had never managed with any consistency. Edmund managed it with considerable consistency. He kept his own records, cross-checked quarterly against the steward's reports, and had developed the habit, over 16 years of administration, of never accepting a number he had not independently verified. It was that habit that first brought Hartwell to his attention. The estate had needs that did not wait on private grief or private inconvenience. The Southfield drainage had required attention every winter for 3 years running. The home farm's yield on the eastern acres had declined since the previous bailiff retired, and his replacement proved optimistic in his estimates. The lime-washed dairy walls needed to be done again before the spring, and the arrangement with the local contractor had lapsed in the year of Caroline's death and had not been renewed at the old rate. Edmund attended to all of these things with the methodical patience he brought to everything that could not be delegated, because the estate was not an abstraction. It was 460 acres of land that fed 22 households of tenants and employed 31 people inside the house and outbuildings, and those people ate and paid their rent and educated their children at the estate school on the basis of decisions he made before breakfast. He had suspected Hartwell for 11 months. Suspected was too mild a word. He had understood for 11 months that something was wrong in the timber accounts and the household supply contracts and the quarterly settlements from 3 tenant farms, and he had traced the wrong thing, methodically, through 3 sets of parallel records kept in a locked box in the estate library to Hartwell's hand. The difficulty was proof, not evidence, which he had in abundance. Proof of a kind that would hold in front of a magistrate, and not merely in front of Edmund's own certain knowledge. Hartwell was clever. He was not brilliant, but he was practiced. He had been stealing from the estate for what Edmund calculated to be 6 years, since the year of Caroline's death, when Edmund had been too consumed with private grief to watch closely. The sums, added together, were considerable. £430 over 6 years, not counting the value of the diverted timber. £430 extracted from an estate that had been stretched already by the roof repairs and by 3 consecutive bad harvests in the late years of the previous decade. Edmund needed to catch him in the act, not in the records, where Hartwell could plausibly claim error, but in the physical transfer itself. The moment of exchange. He had known, since the morning he conceived the plan, that it was peculiar. He was prepared for that. What he had not fully accounted for was the degree to which performing blindness required one to depend on the eyes of others. A man pretending not to see in his own household had to appear genuinely sightless to a clever servant who knew his master's habits, while still managing the estate well enough that nothing appeared amiss. The performance was, in its way, exhausting. He had reduced his movement through certain corridors. He had stopped reading correspondence at his desk in the evenings, sitting instead with papers unfolded in his lap and his eyes toward the fire. He had learned to listen to footsteps, which people rarely modified once they believed themselves unobserved. What he had not anticipated was that the performance would be seen through within 5 days by a woman who had been in his household for 7 months and whose particular quality of attention he had managed, until that moment, to entirely underestimate. She came to him 3 days after the evening in the corridor, appearing in the study doorway at a moment when he happened to be reviewing the timber contracts, with his eyes deliberately turned toward the fire rather than toward the door. She knocked twice, received no response, and then said, with a quietness that was not timid in the least, "I believe you can hear me perfectly well, my lord." He had turned then. He could not help it. She was standing in the doorway in her gray Spencer jacket with the household ledger under her arm, and her expression was one of settled certainty rather than triumph, which he respected considerably. "Sit down," he said. She did, with a composure that told him she had prepared for his refusal. She opened the ledger to a marked page and placed it on the desk between them without ceremony. "The flour delivery in October was recorded as 12 sacks, she said. "I counted 10 in the larder. The difference has been occurring in the supply account since at least March. I cannot speak to before March, as I was not here." She did not say Hartwell's name. She did not need to. Edmund looked at the page for a long moment. Then he looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, which he noted. "How long have you known?" he said. "I began to suspect in July," she said. "I became certain in September. I did not speak because it was not my place, and because I did not yet understand the full situation." She paused. "I understand it better now." He asked her then, carefully and without particular warmth, which was his most reliable instrument for judging character, whether she would be willing to tell him precisely what she had observed and when she had observed it, and to continue noting what she saw until the moment he chose to act on it. She said she would, in the way a woman says something when she has already thought it through, not as a woman seeking approval. "You should know," he said, "that this will require discretion. Hartwell must not suspect you have spoken to me." "He does not notice me particularly," she said, "which has been useful." The room had decided she was furniture long before she understood the room well enough to find it useful. That was the truth the season had applied to Cecily Vane. Not cruel, not deliberate, simply the reflexive dismissal of a hierarchy that had no established category for a well-educated clergyman's daughter managing another woman's household. She was not a servant precisely, and not a companion precisely, and not a relation. She was, in the formulation of Lady Ashford, the Earl's mother, a woman overheard in a drawing room she evidently considered private, merely competent, which is what one hires, and not what one invites. Cecily had heard it, and folded it neatly, and placed it in the same interior drawer where she kept the other such verdicts, alongside her father's debts and the dissolution of the household she had managed for him for 4 years before his death, and the understanding that she would manage other people's households for the rest of her life. This was not a tragedy so much as a fact that required accommodation. She was not the sort of woman who wept over facts. What she was, as Edmund had correctly assessed, was observant. She had spent 7 months cataloging the house, its rhythms and its loyalties, its small competitions and its established alliances. She knew which maids deferred to Hartwell and which avoided him. She knew that the kitchen boy had once found Hartwell in the cellars at an unusual hour and had been given 6pence not to mention it. She knew that the timber merchant who came quarterly always stayed longer in the steward's office than the volume of business warranted. She began keeping her own record, small entries in the back of a personal journal she kept locked in her room, dates and quantities and names observed. She was meticulous because her father had been a clergyman who kept meticulous parish records, and she had learned the discipline at his elbow. Numbers did not lie, he had told her many times. People lie about numbers. Numbers are only as honest as the people who record them. And so the discipline of the honest observer is to write down what she sees before she has time to interpret it. She wrote down what she saw. She wrote with a penny candle that she rationed to 2 hours a night. Bent over the journal at the small writing table in her room, with the window dark beyond, and the house settling around her into its late autumn quiet, she had learned, in her father's parsonage, that the discipline of recording is also the discipline of seeing. One cannot write down precisely what one has observed without first having observed it precisely, without having committed, in the moment of looking, to the belief that the looking matters. She had looked at the timber merchant and the length of his visits. She had looked at the supply invoices against the larder inventory. She had looked at Hartwell's new horse, a bay gelding stabled beside the Earl's own horses, and she had priced the animal in her mind and found the figure uncomfortable. The house moved around her without particularly attending to her, which she had learned to regard as an advantage. The maids spoke freely in corridors she passed through. The footmen did not moderate their complaints when she was present, having classified her, after 3 weeks, as harmless to their interests. Even Hartwell treated her as a minor administrative counterpart, whose sphere was linen counts and larder inventory, and did not meaningfully intersect with his own considerable authority over the estate finances. He was wrong about that. He would not know he was wrong for some time yet. On the 21st of November, she saw Hartwell pocket a folded document in the courtyard while speaking to a man she did not recognize, a transaction so swift and ordinary in aspect that a less attentive observer would have registered nothing. She wrote it down. She recorded the time, the approximate dimensions of the document, the direction in which the unknown man departed, and the fact that Hartwell had returned to the house whistling quietly afterward, which she had never heard him do before. On the 2nd of December, she came into the kitchen passage to retrieve a forgotten glove and found Hartwell at the side door accepting a small canvas bag from a boy she recognized as the son of the village butcher. The boy's expression was that of someone performing an errand he had been paid not to describe. She went back for the glove a different way and wrote down what she had seen before she sat down to dinner. On the 4th of December, Edmund asked her to walk with him in the East Garden at 2:30, which was the hour Hartwell generally used for his weekly ride to the village, on a horse far too fine for a steward's salary. They walked at a proper social distance, which was the only distance available to them in the gray afternoon light, with the stone walls of the house visible behind, and 2 gardeners working at the far end of the yew walk. The path between the low box hedges was damp from the morning's frost, the ground not yet hard enough to wring underfoot, but no longer soft. The last of the autumn's leaves lay flat against the stone edging, dark and pressed. The sky above was the particular muted white of late November in the English countryside, the kind of sky that gives no shadow and produces a light that seems to come from everywhere equally. She was aware of him at her left side with the persistent, particular awareness she had spent 4 months trying to reclassify as professional attentiveness. He listened to her account of both observations without interrupting. He asked one question at the end. "Would you be willing to be present when I confront him?" She considered it. She understood what it would mean. A woman who appeared at a confrontation of this nature was a woman who had involved herself in the estate's private affairs beyond the strictest reading of her position. And the strictest reading of her position was the only reading that carried no social cost. "Yes," she said. She said it as she had said everything to him, with the particular quality of a decision already made. He looked at her then for a longer moment than he had looked at her in the study, which she felt as a specific physical thing, a warmth that gathered in her chest without her permission, and had no rational name. She looked at the bare yew hedge, rather than at his face, because looking at his face at close range required a composure she was not entirely certain she could produce. "You have been generous with what you know," he said. His voice was different from the voice he used in household matters, lower, more considered. She did not know what to do with that, and so she did nothing with it, which was her most reliable default. They returned separately to the house. The dark moment came on the 9th of December, a Thursday, at the close of the dinner service for a party of 8 that Lady Ashford had arranged with the specific purpose of presenting Miss Dorothea Farley to Edmund's consideration. Miss Farley was everything the season recognized as correct. She was 21 and fair, and her family held good property in Wiltshire, and she had a laugh that filled a room pleasantly, and manners so polished they appeared effortless. Lady Ashford had arranged her at Edmund's right hand for dinner and had spent the preceding week in a low, continuous commentary about the practical advantages of such a connection, the kind of commentary that required no explicit argument because its logic was simply the logic of the world as it was constituted. Cecily had been present during the dinner service, invisible in the way a good housekeeper is invisible, watching the dishes come and go, noting that the claret had been opened from the second cellar rather than the first, and making a mental note to speak to Hartwell about it in the morning. She had also noted that Edmund had spoken to Miss Farley with perfect courtesy, and without any particular quality of attention. She noted this, and placed it firmly in the category of things that were not her concern. After the dinner, when the guests had moved to the drawing room and the table was being cleared, she encountered Hartwell in the passage between the dining room and the kitchen. He had been carrying a small wooden case she recognized as belonging to the decanted bottles from the first cellar. 3 bottles she had identified as missing 2 weeks ago and attributed to a discrepancy she had not yet resolved. "Mrs. Vane," he said. He always called her Mrs. rather than Miss. A small habitual displacement that she had stopped correcting, because correcting it cost social energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. He looked at her with his pale, watery eyes, the specific look he gave to things he was calculating. "The Earl has asked me to send these to his solicitor in Taunton tomorrow," he said. "A gift, I understand." It was a lie. She knew it was a lie because she had been present 2 days ago when Edmund had noted that the first cellar stock was to be reserved entirely for the Christmas party. She said nothing. She produced the small professional smile that was her most reliable instrument for appearing to receive information at face value, and she went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. She was not afraid of Hartwell precisely. She was afraid in the way that a woman who has learned to survive on very little is afraid of the moment when survival requires spending what remains. She had a position. She had a reference from her previous employer and the beginnings of a steady arrangement at Ashford Park, and a room of her own, and 3 meals a day, and a small salary that, saved with discipline, could become something real over time. And she had understood, sitting on the bed in the cold room with the candle guttering at the desk, that Hartwell knew she had been watching him. Not suspected. Knew. She had seen it in the pause before he spoke in the passage. The slight recalculation behind the lie. And she understood that the lie itself had been a test of her reaction. She understood also that she had perhaps 2 days before he acted on what he had concluded. She took her journal from the locked drawer. She reviewed her entries from September to December, reading them in the order she had written them, each entry precise and dated, each one a deposit made against the possibility that she would one day need to withdraw everything at once. She had not known when she began that she was preparing evidence. She had known only that her father's voice was in her ear, telling her to write down what she saw before she had time to interpret it. She had interpreted it now. She read the full account and found it held together, each observation consistent with the next, no gaps she had papered over with assumption. It would hold. She had made sure, entry by entry, that it would hold. She replaced the journal in the locked drawer and kept only the key. Then she went downstairs. Edmund was alone in the study. The house party had retired. He was reading by the fire. The ledger she had originally brought him resting on the desk beside his chair, his left hand on its cover. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and there was nothing in his face of the studied blankness he had worn for weeks. He looked, simply, directly at her. "He knows," she said. Edmund set the book down and rose. He crossed to the desk and picked up the ledger, not because he needed it in that moment, but because his hands required occupation, which she noted and found, obscurely, steadying. A man who needed to do something with his hands was a man who was not indifferent to what had just been said. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, as he always listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and settled behind him. Outside, the wind came up along the stone face of the house and found the gap under the study door. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "At 8. Before he leaves for Taunton with whatever he is planning to take." "Yes," she said. He looked at her across the desk. The fire was low, and the room was warm, and the distance between them was the width of the desk, which was not very large, and she was aware of that distance as a measurement for the first time. Aware of it in the way one becomes aware of the weight of a door when one is about to open it. "Miss Vane," he said, and stopped. She waited. "You have been worth more to this house than you have been compensated for," he said. "I am aware of that." "You are paying me fairly for the position," she said, because it was true, and because she was constitutionally unable to accept credit. She did not believe she had earned. "I am paying you what the position is rated," he said. "That is not the same thing as what you are worth." She had nothing to say to that, and so she said nothing. And the silence in the room was different from the silences that had preceded it. There was warmth in it, the way a fire that has been burning for some time radiates warmth into a room without calling attention to itself. She went back upstairs. She lay awake for an hour, and then slept, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake until dawn. She had instead, at some point she could not identify, decided that what happened in the morning would happen, and that she had done what was necessary, and that the rest was beyond her management. The confrontation took place in Hartwell's office at 8 in the morning, in the presence of Edmund, Cecily, and Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor from Taunton who had been sent for 2 days previously through a channel that Hartwell had no reason to know about. Fenwick was a small, quiet man in a brown coat who produced documents when required and said very little, and whose presence in the room constituted, as Edmund had calculated, the procedural seal that transformed a private reckoning into a binding one. Hartwell had been surprised to find Cecily there. He looked at her with his pale, watery eyes, and something behind them shifted. A recalculation she watched happen in real time. "You have been helpful to Lord Ashford," he said. His voice was very controlled. "I had not understood how helpful." "Merely competent," she said, and did not smile. Edmund placed 3 documents on Hartwell's desk. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice at any point in the entire enterprise, which she found deeply characteristic. He explained, with the patient precision of a man who had been building a case for 11 months, exactly what the records showed, exactly what had been verified by independent accounting, and exactly what would follow from this meeting. He explained that Mr. Fenwick was present to witness Hartwell's acknowledgement and to advise on the terms under which the matter could be resolved without recourse to the magistrate, and on the terms under which it could not. Hartwell looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at Cecily once more, with the considering look of a man calculating whether she could be discredited, and then he looked at Fenwick. And he understood by Fenwick's unremarkable expression that she could not be. He agreed, in Fenwick's careful record, to every term. He was gone from Ashford Park before noon. What happened after was very quiet, in the way that a room is quiet after a window has been closed against a wind it has been enduring for some time. Edmund came to her in the small sitting room she used for household paperwork at 3:30 in the afternoon, when the house had settled into its winter stillness. She had been reviewing the December supply contracts with a fresh eye, making notes in the margin of a new ledger, because the work was there, and she was the sort of person who did the work that was in front of her. He knocked. She said, "Come in," and he came in, and closed the door behind him, which was the first time he had closed a door between her and the rest of the house. He stood for a moment in the middle of the room. The afternoon light from the window caught the scar at his left temple, silver white and familiar to her now, in the way that a particular feature of a face becomes familiar when one has spent a long time deliberately not looking at it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "It has nothing to do with the household." "I understand," she said. She did understand. She had understood, she thought, since the evening in the corridor when she had first recognized that the stillness at the window was not indifference. She had understood, and had not allowed herself to act on the understanding, because acting on it had seemed, at every point in the intervening months, like a luxury she could not afford. She was the housekeeper. She occupied the category the season had given her, the woman who was merely competent and therefore not considered. She had been looked at by him, in corridors and over ledgers and in the garden, with a quality of attention that she had catalogued with the same discipline she brought to the flower accounts, and told herself she was misreading. She had not been misreading. He sat down across from her, in the chair on the other side of the small table, and he did not produce the authoritative posture of the study or the measured distance of the corridor. He sat like a man who had decided to stop managing the distance between himself and a thing he wanted. "I should like you to know," he said, "that I have not been unaware of you. Not for some months." She felt her hand still in her lap. Not the composed stillness she manufactured for difficult conversations, but a different quality entirely. The stillness of a person who has stopped pretending not to feel something. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her with the directness he reserved for things that mattered. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that I am asking this from a position of considerable advantage, and that the obvious answer for a woman in your situation is not necessarily the true answer. I want the true answer." The careful honesty of that moved her more than a declaration would have. He had named the asymmetry directly. He had not pretended it did not exist. "The true answer," she said slowly, "is that I have spent 6 months telling myself very firmly that you were my employer, and the situation had one correct management, and that management was professional distance. And now?" he said. "And now Mr. Hartwell is gone," she said. "And I cannot think of a single reason that professional distance remains the best available answer." Something in his expression settled. Not relief precisely, but the quality of a man who had been holding a question at careful arm's length for a very long time, and had at last been given leave to set it down. "Cecily," he said. Her name, her first name, in his voice, without title and without distance. She felt it as a distinct physical event, a warmth that moved through her chest and settled there. She looked at him across the small table in the winter light, the ledger open before her, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, his hazel eyes steady, and the scar visible at his temple, and she felt the entirety of the preceding 7 months rearrange itself into a shape she could finally read without deliberate obstruction. "Yes," she said. There was a moment of perfect quiet. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, briefly and with a care that was both correct and unmistakable, and her hand beneath his lay entirely still. Not from composure, but from something considerably warmer than composure. Lady Ashford did not receive the news with warmth. She received it in the morning room 3 days later, with Miss Farley's name still fresh in her social calculations, and she deployed, in the first 30 seconds, the 3 phrases she relied upon to organize any situation she found structurally inconvenient. She called Cecily capable, inflected to mean small. She called the decision impulsive, inflected to mean beneath Edmund's dignity. She said, with the polished equanimity of a woman whose social authority had always served her well, that the housekeeper had evidently been very useful, and she used the word useful in the specific register she reserved for things she intended to diminish. Edmund listened until she finished. She found the man who was robbing this estate for 6 years, he said. She did it while you were arranging dinner parties. I would ask you to speak of her by her name. Lady Ashford looked at her son with the expression of a woman encountering a script she did not entirely recognize. Miss Vane, Edmund said, will be Lady Ashford before spring. I am informing you as a courtesy, not requesting your permission. The morning room held very still. Lady Ashford looked from her son to the woman beside him, the woman in the cream gown and the gray Spencer with the small, dark ledger held under her arm and the steady gray-green eyes that did not drop. Cecily met her gaze without challenge, without triumph, without anything except the quiet composure that had been her primary instrument since the moment she had arrived in this house. With £15 and a box of books and the understanding that she would make herself necessary and see what became of it. She had not, she thought, expected this particular outcome of that strategy. Lady Ashford sat back in her chair. Something in her face shifted, not softening precisely, but re-examining. The expression of a woman whose categories had ceased to account for the evidence before her, and who was old enough and clear-sighted enough to recognize that sensation for what it was. Miss Vane, she said at last. Not Mrs. the correct form, delivered with a degree of precision that cost her something visible. Lady Ashford, Cecily said. The morning room released its breath. There was the announcement, made through the correct channels with Fenwick's assistance, and there was the expected season of comment and social adjustment, which occupied several weeks, and which Cecily observed with the same methodical attention she had brought to the ledgers, noting what changed and what did not. What did not change was the work. She continued through the winter, managing the household through the transition, the new steward's appointment and his first weeks, the December accounts and the January accounts, the roof survey that had been deferred for 3 seasons and could no longer wait. She worked alongside Edmund in the evenings when the house was quiet, the two of them at the study table with the fire built up and the records spread between them, and she understood in those evenings that the long period of pretending not to see each other had passed entirely, and that what remained was something considerably more comfortable than either of them had managed before. He told her about Caroline one evening in January. He told her simply and without performance, the small portrait miniature on the desk between them, and she listened with the full attention she brought to things that required it. He had believed for 3 years that he had not been watchful enough, had not understood what was happening in time to act on it. The belief had sat in him like a splinter, long enough to become familiar. She said, "You were 28, and you did precisely what the physician directed. No honest accounting of those circumstances produces a different outcome." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "It does not." He placed the miniature back in the drawer the following morning, not concealed, simply stored, which was different, and which she noted without comment. They were married in the small church at the edge of the estate on a Tuesday in early March, attended by the household staff and 2 of Edmund's cousins and the elderly vicar, who had known Edmund since boyhood and who conducted the ceremony with the careful dignity it deserved. Cecily wore her best gown, the cream silk she had been saving since before her father's death, for an occasion that had always seemed somewhat theoretical until it became actual. Edmund's hand at hers during the service was warm and steady, and she held it with the same quality of decision she had brought to every other significant moment in the preceding 8 months. The small church was cold and fragrant, with winter greenery, and the light through the plain windows was the gray-white light of early March, and she thought, listening to the vicar speak, of the evening in the corridor, and the amber candle light, and the figure at the window who had not turned. And she thought that she had understood something that evening that she had not yet had the right language to name. She had named it now. If this story found you somewhere in the quiet of an evening, leave a word in the comments below. Stories like this one are made to be shared, and it is good to know who is listening. That evening, when the small celebration had ended and the house had grown still around them, she stood at the window of the upstairs sitting room and watched the last of the winter light leave the sky above the gray stone walls. She had the ledger with her, as she usually had it when she was thinking. The small dark brown book with the brass clasp and the red silk ribbon still marking the October flower discrepancy that had first made Hartwell's dishonesty legible to her. Edmund appeared in the doorway and came to stand beside her, not touching, only present in the specific way he was present when he had chosen to simply occupy the same space without requiring anything of the moment. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Numbers," she said. "Good ones this time." He made the sound that was the closest thing he produced to a laugh, a short, warm exhale that she felt at her left side. Outside the window, the bare branches of the old oak at the end of the garden were silvered by the last cold light, and the stone of the house was gray and solid, and hers now in a way she had not permitted herself to consider before, because considering it had felt too much like assuming an outcome she had not yet earned. She had earned it. Not through accident or connection or the rotation of fortune's wheel. She had earned it through 7 months of careful attention, honest record-keeping, and the willingness to spend what remained when the moment required it. She closed the ledger and set it back on the windowsill beside her. She stayed at the window with him as the sky went fully dark, and she did not feel the particular solitary cold that had been, for most of the last 2 years, her most reliable companion. It had been replaced by something that required no entry in any ledger. She knew it by the warmth of him standing at her left side, and by the old oak in the window, and by the sound of the house settling quietly around them into the first evening of what came next. She had come to Ashford Park to be useful. She had stayed because she was seen.